Good evening. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News headquarters in New York. Well, at its beginning, this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and American warships on the sea lanes leading to Cuba.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
In October 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war, with the Soviet Union quietly building missile bases just 90 miles off the coast of the United States. The delicate balance of power was about to shatter.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Compelling History. Today, we'll dive into the 13 days that brought the world closer to nuclear disaster than ever before, the Cuban Missile Crisis. How close did we come to catastrophe and how was it averted? Stick around to find out. If you're new here, we release videos every week exploring significant events, places, and people from history. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy it, and subscribe so you don't miss any of our future content. Now, let's get into the video. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just a moment in time, it was the culmination of decades of political tension. How did the world get from the fragile optimism after World War II to the brink of nuclear annihilation during the most dangerous 13 days in history? To understand, we need to step back and examine the Cold War, a global ideological struggle between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. After World War II, the US and USSR emerged as ideological adversaries, despite having been wartime allies. The US promoted democracy and capitalism, while the USSR sought to expand communism. This clash fueled a geopolitical chess game that defined the latter half of the 20th century. Both nations engaged in proxy wars, espionage, arms races, and even a technological competition in the space race. Amid this tense backdrop, the Cuban Revolution of 1959 added a volatile element. Fidel Castro and his 26th of July movement overthrew Fulgencio Batista, a US-backed dictator. Initially, the US was ambivalent about Castro, but his land reforms and nationalization policies, which targeted American businesses, quickly alienated Washington. By 1960, the US had imposed a trade embargo on Cuba, setting the stage for heightened hostility. Facing economic strangulation and political isolation, Castro turned to the Soviet Union for support. The USSR eagerly embraced Cuba, seeing an opportunity to establish a communist ally just 90 miles from US shores. The Soviet-Cuban relationship deepened as the USSR provided military and economic aid. By aligning with Cuba, the USSR extended its influence into the Western Hemisphere, a move that alarmed the United States. In 1961, tensions escalated with the Bay of Pigs invasion. This CIA-backed attempt by Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro ended in a humiliating failure for the US, solidifying Castro's alignment with the Soviets and convincing him of the need for stronger military protection. Meanwhile, the Cold War's arms race reached new heights. The Soviet Union's leader, Nikita Khrushchev, sought to close the missile gap with the US, even as Soviet capabilities lagged behind. Khrushchev's bombastic claims about Soviet missile production masked the reality of their relative inferiority. By 1962, he viewed Cuba as a strategic solution. Stationing nuclear missiles on the island would level the playing field and deter any US invasion of Cuba. In the spring of 1962, Fidel Castro agreed to host Soviet nuclear missiles. For Khrushchev, this move was both a bold geopolitical gamble and a means to secure Cuba's loyalty amid fears it might drift towards China. Soviet military shipments to Cuba increased, including conventional arms, anti-aircraft missiles, and eventually nuclear weapons. For Castro, the missile deal promised a deterrent against future U.S. aggression. By the summer of 1962, U.S. intelligence began detecting unusual Soviet military activity in Cuba. The prospect of nuclear weapons stationed so close to American soil was an existential threat. With both sides entrenching their positions, the stage was set for a confrontation that would bring the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 reconnaissance flight over Cuba revealed a development that would push the Cold War to its most perilous moment. Captured photographs showed Soviet-made medium-range ballistic missiles under construction at a site in San Cristobal, Pinar del Rio province. These missiles, capable of striking major U.S. cities like Washington, D.C., New York, and Miami, fundamentally altered the strategic balance between the United States and the Soviet Union. The origins of this alarming discovery can be traced back to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's decision earlier that year to deploy missiles in Cuba. Khrushchev, facing a significant nuclear disadvantage, sought to counter the U.S.'s growing lead in strategic missile capabilities. At the time, the Soviet Union had only 20 intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of reaching the U.S., and their reliability was questionable. By positioning medium-range missiles in Cuba, the Soviets could achieve a credible deterrent while signaling unwavering support for Fidel Castro's government. Secrecy was paramount to the Soviet operation, codenamed Operation Anadir. To mask the true purpose of their mission, Soviet troops were disguised as agricultural workers, and the equipment shipped to Cuba was misleadingly labeled. Despite these efforts, U.S. intelligence had been gathering reports since August of suspicious activities in Cuba. Ground observers noted unusual convoys, and reconnaissance flights identified surface-to-air missile sites resembling Soviet patterns used to protect ICBM bases. In early October, the U.S. resumed U-2 flights over Cuba after a 5-week hiatus caused by international tensions and poor weather. On October 14th, Major Richard Heiser's U-2 flight captured over 900 images, including unmistakable evidence of an SS-4 missile construction site. These photographs were promptly analyzed, confirming the worst fears of American intelligence officials. The missile sites, if completed, would allow the Soviets to launch a nuclear strike against the U.S. with little warning. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors were immediately briefed on the findings. The gravity of the situation led to the formation of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM, a group tasked with managing the crisis. Tensions within EXCOM were palpable. Some military leaders pushed for immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites, while others warned of the catastrophic risk of escalating into nuclear war. A more measured approach, advocated by Kennedy and several civilian advisors, involved a naval quarantine of Cuba, a blockade intended to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment to the island. The decision to pursue a quarantine was strategic. It avoided the immediate escalation that airstrikes might provoke, while also giving the U.S. a platform for diplomatic negotiations. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation in a televised speech, revealing the existence of the missile sites and announcing the quarantine.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
He issued a stark warning to the Soviet Union. Any nuclear attack launched from Cuba would result in a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. The quarantine escalated tensions rapidly. Soviet ships carrying additional missile components approached the blockade line, while U.S. naval forces prepared to intercept them. Meanwhile, the world watched anxiously as the crisis unfolded, unsure whether diplomacy or disaster would prevail. The discovery of the missiles and the subsequent U.S. response marked the beginning of a 13-day standoff that brought the Cold War's superpowers closer to nuclear war than ever before.
I'd hate like heck to see us go to war, but if it's necessary to prevent a nuclear war, I think the action has to be taken at this time.
Well, I think it's high time we stopped Russia from having things our own way.
We only have a few more months to go on reserves, and I just hope they don't grab me, that's all.
I know that some action should be taken, but he's going to have to tread very lightly, short of war.
I think it's gone beyond the stage of whether or not we support the president or we don't support him. It's way past that.
As Soviet ships approached the blockade, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. The U.S. military was on high alert, with air bases and missile sites ready for immediate action. Behind closed doors, diplomacy intensified. On October 25th, the United States requested an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council. During the meeting, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin, demanding an admission about the missiles in Cuba. Zorin's refusal to respond only heightened tensions. Simultaneously, Strategic Air Command, SAC, raised its readiness to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level ever reached in U.S. history. B-52 bombers patrolled continuously, while B-47 bombers stood ready to launch within 15 minutes. Nuclear-armed interceptors were dispersed to strategic locations, and U.S. Navy ships enforced the blockade, intercepting vessels to ensure they carried no military supplies. Amid the mounting pressure, back-channel diplomacy began to take shape. U.S. journalist John Scully met with KGB Station Chief Alexander Fomin, who floated the idea of a potential compromise. The Soviets suggested removing their missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. That evening, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent a personal and emotional letter to President John F. Kennedy, proposing this very deal. However, the following day, Khrushchev issued a second message, demanding the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey in addition to the non-invasion pledge. The conflicting proposals complicated negotiations, with the U.S. Executive Committee, ex-COMEM, debating the best course of action. On October 27th, the crisis reached its peak. A U-2 reconnaissance plane, piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson, was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet missile, killing Anderson. The act risked triggering an immediate military response from the United States. President Kennedy, under intense pressure from his advisors and the military, chose restraint, signaling his commitment to diplomacy while warning the Soviets that further attacks would provoke retaliation. Meanwhile, low-level reconnaissance flights over Cuba increased in frequency to monitor missile activity. Behind the scenes, Attorney General Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin. During this meeting, Robert Kennedy conveyed a message from the president. The U.S. was prepared to accept the terms of Khrushchev's initial offer, but would not publicly acknowledge the removal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The missiles, deemed obsolete by U.S. military planners, were already slated for withdrawal, but a public trade could undermine NATO's unity and the U.S.'s strategic position. The critical breakthrough came on October 28th. Khrushchev, aware of the escalating danger and the potential for catastrophic consequences, announced via Radio Moscow that the Soviet Union would dismantle its missile installations in Cuba and return the weapons to the USSR. In return, the U.S. publicly agreed not to invade Cuba and privately assured the Soviets that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey would be removed within months. The crisis ended with both sides avoiding nuclear conflict, though tensions remained high. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point in Cold War diplomacy. A direct hotline between Washington and Moscow was established to prevent future miscommunication. The events also highlighted the importance of measured responses and back-channel negotiations in averting disaster. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. But through calculated diplomacy and the willingness to compromise, humanity stepped back from the abyss. Thank you so much for watching our video exploring the tense history behind the Cuban Missile Crisis. We hope you enjoyed this video and are looking forward to more videos from us. Let us know in the comments below if you have any suggestions on videos you'd like to see covered. Before you go, make sure you like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and want to see more history-related content.